Ever wondered how two superpowers could fight a war for over 40 years without ever directly firing a shot at each other? That's the story of the Cold War, a fascinating and terrifying period of modern history. And today, we're diving deep into it using one of the best guides out there. John Lewis Gaddis's book, The Cold War, A New History. So, where did it all begin? The roots of the Cold War trace back to the end of World War II. The world was shattered, and two giants emerged from the ruble, the United States and the Soviet Union. But they couldn't have been more different. The US championed capitalism, individual freedom, and democracy. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was built on communism, with the state controlling everything. These weren't just different economic systems. They were opposing worldviews, each convinced it held the key to humanity's future. Think back to conferences like Yalta in 1945. Leaders like Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin were supposed to be carving out a peaceful future. But in reality, they were drawing new lines on the map. Stalin wanted a buffer zone of friendly communist states in Eastern Europe to protect the Soviet Union, while the US and Britain wanted free elections and self-determination for those same countries. This fundamental disagreement set the stage for decades of conflict. It was like two chess players setting up the board, each planning their opening moves for a game that would engulf the entire globe. At the heart of the Cold War was this clash of ideologies. It wasn't just about land or resources. It was a battle for hearts and minds. The United States saw itself as a defender of the free world, promoting liberal democracy and open markets. The Soviet Union positioned itself as the leader of a global revolution, promising to liberate workers from capitalist exploitation. Both sides genuinely believed their system was superior and destined to triumph. This ideological fervor fueled everything, turning international relations into a moral crusade. Every political event, every cultural exchange, every sporting competition became another battlefield in this struggle for supremacy. And this battle had the most dangerous weapons ever created. The nuclear arms race is one of the most chilling aspects of the Cold War. It began when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Japan in 1945. The Soviets, stunned by this new power, rushed to develop their own. By 1949, they succeeded, and the race was on. Both sides began stockpiling thousands of nuclear warheads, each one more powerful than the last. This led to a terrifying doctrine known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It's a grimly fitting acronym. The idea was that if one side launched a nuclear attack, the other would have enough weapons left to retaliate and destroy the attacker completely. This balance of terror, this promise of total annihilation, is what prevented a direct, hot war between the two superpowers. But it also meant the entire world lived under the constant shadow of a mushroom cloud. But just because they didn't fight directly doesn't mean there was no bloodshed. The Cold War was fought through proxy wars across the globe. Instead of US soldiers fighting Soviet soldiers, they backed opposing sides in regional conflicts. We saw this in Korea in the early 1950s, where the North was supported by the Soviets and Chinese, and the South by the US and its allies. We saw it in Vietnam, a long and brutal war where American forces fought against communist-backed North Vietnamese. We saw it in Afghanistan, where the US armed Mujahideen fighters to resist the Soviet invasion. These proxy wars were devastating for the countries involved, turning them into battlegrounds for a global power struggle they had little say in. Millions of lives were lost, not in a direct US-Soviet conflict, but in these outsourced battles for influence. And then came the moment when the world held its breath. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was the closest we ever came to a loud nuclear war. It started when the Soviet Union secretly began placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. When US surveillance planes discovered the sites, the world plunged into a 13-day standoff. President John F. Kennedy's administration debated options ranging from a full-scale invasion of Cuba to a naval blockade. For nearly 2 weeks, people around the world watched, terrified, as the two most powerful men on Earth, Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, engaged in a high-stakes negotiation. A single miscalculation, a single wrong move, could have triggered a nuclear holocaust. Thankfully, diplomacy prevailed. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a US pledge not to invade Cuba, and a secret agreement to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. The crisis was a wake-up call, showing both sides just how close they were to the abyss. After staring into that abyss, things started to change, albeit slowly. The 1970s brought a period known as détente, which is a French word for the easing of strained relations. The fear from the Cuban Missile Crisis led to a desire for more stable and predictable interactions. President Richard Nixon and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev held summits and signed important treaties. The most significant of these were the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT agreements. These were the first real attempts to put a cap on the nuclear arms race. It didn't end the competition, but it introduced rules to the game. Cultural exchanges increased, and for a brief time, it seemed like the two rivals might learn to coexist more peacefully. However, détente was fragile. It began to unravel by the end of the decade, especially after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, which reignited tensions and set the stage for the final, intense chapter of the Cold War. So, how did it all end? The finale of the Cold War was as dramatic as its beginning. In the 1980s, U.S. President Ronald Reagan took a hardline stance, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire and ramping up military spending. But the real change came from within the Soviet Union itself. In 1985, a new, younger leader named Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet system was crumbling. The economy was stagnant, crushed by the immense costs of the arms race and central planning. He introduced two radical policies: glasnost, which meant openness and more freedom of speech, and perestroika, which meant economic restructuring. He hoped these reforms would save the Soviet system, but instead, they opened the floodgates. People who had been silenced for decades began to demand more change. Nationalist movements in Eastern Europe and within the Soviet republics gained momentum. The Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of the Cold War division, fell in 1989, and by 1991, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist, dissolving into independent nations. The Cold War was over, not with a bang, but with the collapse of one of its main protagonists. The end of the Cold War reshaped the entire world, but its legacy is still with us today. It defined the political map, creating alliances like NATO that still exists. It drove technological innovation, from the space race that put a man on the moon to the development of the internet, which began as a U.S. military project. But it also left behind a world full of nuclear weapons and regional conflicts that have their roots in Cold War-era rivalries. Understanding this period is crucial to understanding the world we live in now. The tensions between great powers, the role of ideology, the danger of proxy wars, these are not just things of the past. They continue to shape our present and our future. Gaddis's work reminds us that history is never really over. It's a story we're still living in. If you found this deep dive into the Cold War interesting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations of the moments that shaped our world. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.